Thank you all for being here. I am not Rich Collins, who is supposed to be your moderator because he's sick. So I'm Peter Lerhner, and I will both moderate and to some extent be a respondent before we turn it over to questions. So there's a famous line, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting, which of course Mark Twain said, except I Googled that and Mark Twain did not say that. There's actually no evidence of who first said it or why it was attributed to Mark Twain, except that it's pithy, but nonetheless, that's sort of the line of how important water is. But I was thinking about, obviously, our bodies are 2/3 water, and whenever we send a spacecraft out, they are looking for water. That is the sign of life on other planets or on other orbital non-planets. And so water is obviously particularly important, yet it's also something that we are particularly bad with. And as we're going to talk about today, we take good water and either pollute it, which is not good because then you can't use it, or we waste it. So here we have this weird situation where the most important element for life, really, perhaps other than air, is treated terribly. And obviously one part of the reason for that is because we don't price it right, we don't think about it right. I live in New York City. For a number of years I worked for the New York City of New York and also for the state of New York. New York City has a tremendous drinking water supply. We get it from upstate, all gravity fed, protected by natural systems. And to realize that the vast majority of that truly extraordinary water is used to flush sewage because we have one system that does everything. Once you think about that, you think, this is sort of crazy. So we're going to hear a few more crazy things about water. We'll have 4 different speakers, and then we will, I hope, have a conversation with all of you, because all of you probably or certainly have your own views of what we can do on the waterfront. So our first speaker is Bill Stowe, and he, for those of us who are lawyers and who have fought to protect water supply, he's actually a bit of a hero because he is fighting to protect his water supply, representing the city of Des Moines against those who are polluting his water, and at least from my perspective, pretty straightforward idea. You're making it expensive for us to provide water to our people. Something's wrong with that. So Bill is also a Harley-Davidson fan, so I figure he is going to have us hit the road, as it were. So,
thank you, Peter.
Bill.
Good afternoon, everybody. You know, I'm sure if you've sat through the sessions yesterday and today, your head's kind of trying to synthesize clean air, clean water, clean soil, the link to food, worker justice issues. I am going to ask you to focus very specifically on clean drinking water and discussion of externalities and industrial ag. I think that I represent a unique niche in that. I'm from Iowa, and Iowa, as you probably know, very different industrial ag producer than California, although we certainly compete with California in terms of pricing the output from our systems. Iowa's the largest corn producer, it's the largest soybean producer. We produce more eggs than any other state. We produce more biofuels than any other state. It is a state that is an extraordinary example for most folks of what the industrial agricultural model, corn and soybean particularly, represent. But I'm going to try to focus on 3 takeaways for you, at least from my vantage. One of them is that drinking water is a public health commodity. It's absolutely critical, obviously, to your individual public health. In the agricultural watersheds that are really predominant in, I'll use the Corn Belt, the I states, Iowa, our neighbor Illinois, and their neighbor Indiana, water quality is driven by land activities, particularly for those of us who are surface water producers. We draw our water from rivers, just as New York draws it from surface water. Here in California, you're largely groundwater, so a little bit different. But for surface water producers, land activities are what drive water quality. And in the agricultural corn belt in particular, corn production. I'm going to focus on nitrate pollution, which is a huge concern for us and really is was mentioned is the basis of our lawsuit. But the point being that a public health commodity very much driven by industrial ag and very difficult to fight the forces of that commercial enterprise, which has huge international implications, but also a regulatory environment that's been pretty lax in how it views industrial agriculture. You know, we heard about New York. New York and its primary, I think it's Tuesday, we are the first in the presidential selection process. So in January, before the February 1st caucus, if you turn down the TV, that's the image you may have seen of my state and my hometown. That's Des Moines, and that's the state capital just up the hill from where I work. That's kind of the national portrait. This is, unfortunately, and the light isn't terribly good here, but a harmful out of bloom. And you could snuff the light here if you would. Can you whack that and perhaps maybe a little bit more? Yeah. Harmful algae bloom, blue-green algae. Large contributor to that is phosphorus as a nutrient. We're going to be a little bit more focused in my comments on nitrogen than phosphorus, but they're both agricultural-related nutrients. That is a huge problem for our brothers and sisters. I'm sorry.
To interrupt, we have to turn on the light because they're filming it. So.
Oh, sorry.
Imagine
I wouldn't want to be in bad lighting for a film. Our brothers and sisters in the Great Lakes have more of a challenge in water production with that than we do because we draw our water from rivers and streams where, in fact, algae has more difficulty in formulating because it's in moving water as opposed to quiescent water, but still a problem in our area. Much about phosphorus that I'll say, I'll focus a lot more on nitrogen here as a nutrient. That is some of your view of Iowa. For those of you who are from the Midwest or what I call the Mideast, Ohio and Indiana, it looks like Bob Evans, doesn't it? Don't you want to drive in, have your picture taken in front of the silo? For those of you that aren't from Eggland, that's the tall cylindrical thing on the left. But you know, I hear all the time from my friends in industrial ag, Iowa feeds the world. How can you dare challenge our agricultural model? 90% of our food as Iowans, unfortunately, is coming from outside Iowa. We feed your gas tank, if you're an ethanol user, or if you're Chinese and buy a lot of imported pork, we help you through our friends in the hog industry and sending pork your way. But very few of what we raise as Iowans, very few of the commodities we raise as Iowans do we consume, unfortunately. But unfortunately, the externality of production is something that we as the locals end up assuming. Wow, let me talk a little bit about Iowa, IOWA. I owe wildlife an apology. My family actually came to the state of it about in the 1850s. Iowa was once this beautiful kind of native prairie with a little forestation around the waterways, which you may be able to tell is what's trying to be shown in the top graphic. Beneath it is what it looks like now, crops. And largely row crops, corn and soybeans, unfortunately, predominate our hydrogeology and our landscape. These are the watersheds that we draw water from. The Des Moines and Raccoon River are the surface waters that we tap directly into. The Des Moines River actually extends up into our friends in Minnesota. The Raccoon River is our preferred water source just because we build our plants along the Raccoon River for convenience sake. 10,000 square miles, overwhelmingly row crop farm. Overwhelmingly row crop farm. The land itself is part of the hydrogeological formations called the Des Moines Lobe. Glaciation comes through Canada, through Minnesota 15,000 years ago, in geological time, not very long ago, provides us this extraordinarily rich soil, but it's soil that has to be drained, and that's why we're a little bit different than a number of other pieces of the puzzle in the ag belt, and really kind of sets the underpinning for our lawsuit. It has to be drained, and it has to be drained artificially, or corn can't be grown very effectively. Corn is not like wet feet. So a drainage system that takes tiling at about, if this were the top of a farm field, about the depth of the lectern, is tiled beneath it. It's a 10 by 10 centers, flexible tile. I think we have a picture of it here pretty shortly. I'll show you. As a surface water provider, we're really, in very broad terms, concerned about three things in the ag belt. We're concerned about suspended solids, soil. If you go to a river in the industrial Midwest, in ag industrial Midwest, draw a cup from it, it looks like cappuccino. It isn't going to taste like cappuccino, and you don't want to try the taste test. A lot of suspended soils in it. If it sits for a few seconds or a few minutes, it'll precipitate out. We're pretty good in our typical process of water treatment called lime softening to remove suspended solids through coagulation, among some other things. You can probably guess river water full of all kinds of microbial issues. Lime softening, our traditional method of treatment, very good at dealing with that. Essentially, we raise the pH so high that we burn out those little microorganisms. But we have a great deal of difficulty removing nutrients. Phosphorus, a little bit easier for us to remove because it typically travels with the soil. Nitrogen actually is part of the water cycle, far more difficult for us to remove. Traditional water treatment processes, sand filters, lime addition, doesn't get rid of it. We have to turn on an ionization facility I'll talk about in a few minutes. We have a number of other things in the Corn Belt like Roundup, atrazine and glyphosate that are pretty common in our water sources. Our treatment of our removal process does a pretty good job, however, taking care of those things. So unlike a lot of smaller water systems, we're not terribly concerned about that. An emerging contaminant that we've talked a little bit about, at least some of the speakers have talked about in the main sessions, pharmaceuticals are increasingly a concern for us. In a state like mine, that has 21 million hogs and 3 million people, I'm not concerned about what you as Iowans may put into your system because it's somewhat regulated. Very concerned about what happens with livestock. There's a great picture of drainage tiles. Again, about the depth between the top of this lectern and the floor itself, there are tiles that are on 10 by 10 centers that have to drain that soil. If you look at the crops and the land itself, like in the lower inset, emerging corn, 6 or 8 inches tall, that's probably early May, maybe mid-May. Soil is very black, but beneath that, there's a drainage process that interrupts the natural filtration in the biome of soil filtering and dealing with the water and the contaminants, and about a meter's depth takes it off laterally into the waters of the state. That is a huge issue for us. Downstream, obviously, we have flood concerns because of that artificial movement of water, but we also have water quality concerns when we rely on surface water. There's something, a construct called the drainage districts in our state. It's the opposite of what you call water districts in California for irrigation. We actually don't take water to land, we remove water. We have about 40 inches of rainfall, give or take, a year in our world. So we want to remove that water, and I mentioned the hydrogeological formation called the Des Moines Lobe. It's the areas where you see all these drainage districts that are necessary because of the newness of the soil to remove water. That creates a point source for us that we believe should have been regulated since the Clean Water Act and never has been, and that's really the basis of our lawsuit. Wow, you can't see that real well. That isn't Mars. That is a county in our watershed. Nothing very natural about that hydrogeology, but it gives you a sense of the tragedy of the commons. The waters of the state essentially become a method of conveyance for not only a quantity of water, but a poor quality of water. People often ask me, why is Des Moines doing this? Why don't we hear about it in St. Louis, New Orleans, San Antonio? Maybe a little bit difficult for you to see, but the intensity of drainage systems in the United States are shown here. Really 3 hot spots: central Iowa, east central Illinois, around the Great Lakes, particularly around Toledo and Cleveland on Lake Erie. So we have a whole different method, unfortunately, of surface water quality being driven by these drainage districts. Yeah, this will give you an example of what we see as a huge change in the industrial ag model. This is loadings. 0 minutes, I'm told. Wow, you've been gone. I'll be done in just about 1 minute. An indication of a change in the model that has severely impacted us. These are loadings in January of this year compared with loadings in years prior. You can tell that's an exponential change in what's going on. Nitrogen and phosphorus, their sources in the hypoxic region in particular. Gene Turner in the back, who's a subject matter expert. The I states for nitrogen, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. We're a huge contributor, obviously, to what goes on in the Gulf Coast. These are 3 counties upstream we've sued. We actually sued their elective officers, elected county boards of supervisors, who in fact oversee these public utility, these drainage districts. We sued them, among other things, for violation of the Clean Water Act, and then also some Iowa claims, nuisance trespass. These are the denitrification units that we turn on anytime we're above the axis here. These are from 95 forward for the last 20 years or so. Anything above the axis is above 10 parts per million of nitrate concentration. That's the lawful limit. So we're having to do something to denitrify any day. You see us above the origin. Notice 8 through 13, not much we had to do there because there are flood years. We've diluted the concentration but added to the loadings. As a water provider, we're more interested in regulated by concentration, not by loadings. Whoops, well, that does me fine. We'll end on this beautiful slide. Again, I owe wildlife an apology. The hydrogeology of my state turned on its head. That's actually one of the drainage districts in one of the counties we've sued. Nothing very natural about that, and talk about an interruption of the process of filtration and biology and microbiology. Wow. Excellent. I am done for now. We'll be back to try and answer some questions in a few minutes.
Before you sit down, could you, this is one of those great lawsuits that anyone's interested in clean water is following closely. Bill, can you just give maybe 1 minute on why you're focusing on this, the extraordinarily expensive additional cost to treat nitrate? You touched on that a little bit, but just emphasize how much it's going to cost you.
Ultimately, to use the vocabulary we've heard at these sessions, we believe an externality of agricultural production has been pushed on down to our water consumers. The cost of nitrogen, particularly as a fertilizer source, is being borne by our ratepayers, and a couple $1 million a year is an operating cost to be able to move nitrate through a process called ionization. But more importantly, we have the world's largest nitrate removal facility. I think Columbus is building one larger than us now, but it's wearing out. We ran it 177 days last year, half the time. It was never constructed for that. So we're having to replace that technology at a cost of 80 to 100. We're still trying to develop that into a final number. That for our ratepayers, just to service the debt to borrow that kind of money, is about a 15% increase compounding each year for the 20 years in which we sell bonds. And from a socioeconomic standpoint, from a social justice standpoint, we represent urban and suburban users. 90% of the public school children in the city of Des Moines get subsidized meals at public school. You know, we're a little bit like the Central Valley in that way. My family and friends upstream, who are ag producers, are sitting on tens of millions of dollars of land per farm. That idea of moving a production cost to our water consumers is absolutely ridiculous. That's the basis of our lawsuit. We see these as point source polluters, just as we would if there were a factory here in San Francisco or a storm sewer system here in San Francisco. The regulators have regulated us as point source dischargers for many years. Agriculture gets a free drop. Those are entirely unregulated.
Great. Thank
that was
you,
more
Bill.
than a minute. But
no, that was great. Bill is, as I said, this case is being watched closely, and Bill's a real hero. I can promise you he went through political challenges to get the case to happen and to continue, which he'll probably only tell you after several drinks, but it's a tough comb. So our next speaker is Hal Candee, who will talk about water quantity and the fights to try to address the water quantity issue here in California. Hal and I worked together for many years at NRDC. He was the lead water litigator there and is a ferocious lawyer and a very persistent one. He'll tell you about a 19-year lawsuit which in many ways replumbed the Central Valley. To the consternation of many, it was successful. So in some parts of California, Hal may not be the most popular person. But as you'll see from his presentation, he's a calm, measured guy. He doesn't actually care too much about this. So he's going to give you the sort of fair and balanced view. Won't be biased at all. So, Hal Candy.
I didn't know what Peter was going to say, but I knew it would be filled with lies. Whatever. Thank you.
Do you have a slideshow?
I have no slides. Okay. Sorry about that. So from water quality to water quantity, and from Iowa back to California, I see a lot of friendly California friends of California here, and I know that you all, a lot of you know a lot about this issue, but I want to just give a quick overview of some of the water allocation conservation issues. Also, I apologize in advance, Dennis may cover some of the same ground at the end in terms of some of the pricing issues and all of that. So I left NRDC about 8 years ago, and I worked for a small public interest law firm called Altshuler Berzon, and I represent a number of environmental organizations doing a number of different water cases. And so my thoughts today are really just kind of looking back on the last 30 years working on these issues. You heard yesterday, Jonathan Foley was talking about how screwed up the whole thing is. I mean, here we are in this gigantic state, this gigantic economy. I think, Paul, you said it was the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world, getting close to 40 million people, some of the largest cities in the country, and yet 80% of the water that's used in the state is still used by agriculture. And I think Jonathan Foley said that alfalfa, which is one crop, uses more water than all of the cities and industry in California combined. So you're putting in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, all of that still uses less than alfalfa. And then on top of that, this very water-intensive crop, in the middle of the drought, we were exporting a lot of this alfalfa overseas. So the system is pretty crazy. And if you look at it on a macro scale, there are all these impacts, all these externalities that have huge fish and wildlife impacts, huge water quality impacts. Another big part of this, though, that's very important to remember is there are winners and losers in the California water system. And this is true, I think, in a lot of the western states. For example, this year, just last week or 10 days ago, they announced the first allocations of water in the largest of the water projects in the state, the Central Valley Project, the federal water project. And some of the people, some of the farmers in the Central Valley were allocated so much water that they are turning it away. They are saying we don't need that much. 100% of their traditional allocations. Others, right next door, were allocated 5% of their entitlement, their federal water contract amount. And those kinds of winners and losers, that kind of water rights system is really crucial to understanding how water is screwed up in the state of California and in the Central Valley in particular. But there's another element to it, which is that even though this embedded water rights system of winners and losers has been around a long time, when you get an allocation like 5%, after we've had some El Nino rains in the wintertime, people don't blame that on the water rights system. They don't blame it on the people with excess amounts using too much, not conserving. They blame it on the environmental laws. And so you've probably heard of a fish called the Delta smelt. There is a tendency, particularly among certain Republican caucuses in the United States Congress, to blame all of the allocation issues on environmental laws. How dare you have water quality protections? How dare you have endangered species protections when that's keeping water from farmers? Never mind that in the San Joaquin Valley, right next door to a district like the Westlands Water District, which got a 5% allocation, there are districts getting 100% allocation, and they get twice as much water per acre as Westlands does. Still much more convenient to blame the environmental laws. So one of the things I want to talk about today is the attempts we have made over the last 25 years to try to deal with the externalities of this massive agricultural system, deal with the externalities by environmental protections, pricing reforms, but every time you try to do that, you are met with this political resistance. We heard about it this morning, about the political resistance, and it is so ingrained. So, for example, we had a hearing this year in which one of the top congressmen on the water subcommittee announced that in his view, during a drought, any decision by the U.S. government to leave any water in a river solely to help fish is insane, and we should forbid it. And then he introduced a bill to make it illegal to release any water or require the release of any water from the dam for the purpose of helping fish. So this is some of the leadership we're getting in helping to address some of these issues. A big part of what drives the California water equation has to do with the San Francisco Bay Delta estuary, the largest estuary on the west coast of North America. We were all here alongside San Francisco Bay. Just east of here near Stockton is where the two longest rivers in the state, the San Joaquin and the Sacramento River, come together. And that delta of those two major rivers has been the source of water for over 20 million Californians. And these gigantic export pumps, the largest system is the federal water project called the Central Valley Project. The second largest is the state water project. And together they take water down to the San Joaquin Valley, to Los Angeles, to San Diego. And these pumps are so huge that they literally pull the rivers backwards. The San Joaquin River goes upstream, not downstream, into the pumps and takes with it all of the fish. And they kill the fish in the pumps. And one of the big issues that are being fought out, in fact, 2 days ago, Senator Feinstein introduced language in the report language for the Bureau of Reclamation spending bill that says, I want to change how you calculate this reverse flow that pulls the river back into the pumps and the impacts that it has on fish. So these are big ticket issues. And when we talk about, what are we going to do to address these impacts of meeting this huge demand for water in California agriculture, and you hit up against some of these baseline protections like the Federal Endangered Species Act, you really have a problem politically if you're trying to protect a 1-inch minnow, the Delta smelt, that's what they like to call the minnow, versus some of the most powerful agribusiness companies in the country. The Westlands Water District, which I mentioned earlier, is the single largest agricultural water district in the country. They were featured in the front page of the New York Times in December because they had spent so many millions of dollars on so many law firms around the country and so many lobbyists that they were this is agribusiness at its most powerful. But also what they have been doing is funneling money into front groups to have people go to Washington pretending to represent farm workers when in fact they were representing agribusiness interests. So some very powerful folks. But I don't want to just talk bad news, which I can do for hours and hours. Two pieces of good news, and there is a lot of progress being made. I mean, people are investing in conservation. There has been a lot of progress made. One of the drivers is the fact that there are policies to try to encourage water conservation. Another is the fact that the price of water is starting to go up in some places, particularly during the drought. And I think Dennis will probably talk a little bit about the water pricing as well. But I think a lot of the smartest farmers are realizing that if I invest in irrigation efficiency and conservation techniques, that's actually good for my bottom line. That actually makes things work better. And so there's a group like Sustainable Conservation, which is working with individual farmers on conservation strategies. Another thing is to how to recharge the groundwater. We had this terrible problem of pumping out too much groundwater during the drought. How do you recharge it during the wet years, but then not over-pump during the dry years and not overly extract and divert water out of the surface streams and try to come up with a better, what they call conjunctive use system. So there are people investing in that. In 1992, a group of us got together and tried to encourage this Central Valley project to do a better job across the board. And what some of the elements of this bill called the Central Valley Project Improvement Act were to increase the price for the people using the most water, with sort of a tiered pricing system, but then give a break for any farmer who was using their farm for habitat, for wildlife habitat, so they would get a break from the highest tiers. Another was to have a more aggressive conservation strategy across the board. Another was to reform these long-term water contracts. The traditional water contract for this massive project only charges about 5 or 10% of the cost of water. And the federal government picks up the rest, the taxpayers. And another thing was to try to allocate some water right off the top to wildlife refuges and to salmon in particular, the doubling of salmon. So there's a lot of reforms that people have made. Of course, it triggered a lawsuit by the San Joaquin Valley, the largest agribusiness interest right off the bat, but those have been resolved. Another thing we tried to do after that was in this 19-year case that Peter mentioned of the San Joaquin River, we came to a consensus agreement with the 28 water districts that get the water out of the San Joaquin River, which flows into the Bay Delta system, where they would agree. They had basically dried up the second longest river in the state, killed off all of the salmon with the help of the federal government. After all this litigation, where we at NRDC and the other environmental fishing groups had continued to win, we reached this consensus agreement, which they agreed for all time they would put about an average of 17% of the total water supply back into the river for fish, and they would agree to work with us to restore the salmon populations. They would agree to pay a higher fee going forward to try to cover some of the costs of restoration. And in exchange, we agreed that they would get a break in wet years on getting more water so they could put it into their groundwater system for consumptive use. They would get some assistance in expanding some of their water canals and help with some of their water management strategies. And the Bush administration approved it, Congress approved it in a bipartisan vote, and every one of those 28 districts, the big irrigation districts, approved the deal. And it's taking a while to implement, but one of the things that turned out to be a problem is that there was one congressman down in the neighborhood who didn't agree with the strategy of settling with environmentalists, didn't agree with the idea of a consensus settlement, even though there were all these protections. In the first 4 years after the settlement was adopted, the farmers got more water than they would have gotten without the settlement, because all of the water supply mitigation kicked in first. Anyway, that congressman turned out to be pretty powerful, and he has 3 times convinced the House of Representatives to pass a bill repealing the entire settlement, repealing the entire agreement. Fortunately, it never passed the Senate, so it hasn't become the law, but that is one of the things we face when we try to put in some of these baseline protections, some of the mitigation. Anyway, there are many more issues. I'm getting noticed here that I have very little time left, so I will stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
He didn't give himself quite enough credit. The Friant Dam case, which is, he said, lasted 19 years, is really an extraordinary case of replumbing. And I had the pleasure of going with the team to the river when it was just beginning to get water back. And it was really quite amazing to think that there was, a 60-mile stretch of river that was dry because all the water had been allocated off. And now, after 19 years of litigation, we were beginning to get water back into it. So it was really an incredible win. And unfortunately, but also fortunately, shows that even in the face of these extraordinarily powerful interests, you can sometimes win. The litigation really did succeed in changing the dynamic there. So our next speaker is Jenny Rempel, who is going to talk about how all of this comes together, water quality and water quantity from the perspective of a community. Jenny is, as you see in the program, with the Community Water Center, focusing on the agriculture there, and is, among other things, has been a CSA member since she was 2. So, despite her youth, she's probably been at this longer than most of the rest of us.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I'm just going to pull up some slides here. Hopefully. Is there a, I can't find the mouse for some reason.
Why don't you talk a little bit and let me see
Sure.
if I can help.
Okay.
You start?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm Jenny Rempel. I am the Sustainable Ag Program Coordinator at the Community Water Center, which is a grassroots environmental justice organization rooted in the Central Valley that uses organizing, advocacy, and public education toward the vision of securing safe, clean, and affordable water for all communities. And I see Janaki here, who really spoke to some of the natural resource disparities that we are feeling firsthand in the Central Valley. So I want to speak to those disparities and the vital need to address them, but also some of the incredible opportunities we have this year and at this point in history to really advance agricultural justice for our rural communities. So hopefully...
I'm not being helpful.
Okay. Oh, no. Thank you for trying.
Thank you for trying, but not succeeding. I think is how that goes.
Okay. Well, I can...
Sorry,
No, thanks for trying.
we're locked.
Yeah, you're locked. Well, I will just go for it. So hopefully I'll have time to speak to two case studies and kind of unite what Bill and Hal were talking about with both water quality and water supply. But I really wanted to just start with the scope of the California drinking water crisis, which I am sad to say this, but makes the nightmare in Flint, Michigan look very small by comparison. So with the drought, we have 13,000 Californians that have run completely out of drinking water. That means that these individuals have to use a bottle or a bucket to wash their dishes, to wash their clothes, to flush the toilet, to make coffee, to wash their hands. And this has been in some cases going on for years at a time. And yet this is a problem that has existed far before the drought even began. Each year there are over 1 million Californians who are impacted by unsafe drinking water, and a lot of that contamination is due directly to agriculture, be it nitrates, pesticides, pesticide byproducts that are in the drinking water coming out of the tap in individuals' homes, at work, and at school. And it's both an urgent problem and a chronic problem. So obviously urgent in terms of you have no running water or you cannot drink the water coming out of your tap. But it's also a chronic problem. So there are 296 small water systems in California that consistently fail to provide safe drinking water to their residents. And in some cases, this has gone on for decades. We work with the community of Arvin, just south of Bakersfield, that's had arsenic in its water for over a decade. Oh, awesome.
This is you, right?
This is me.
All right. Trying to put you in the full screen here.
This is perfect.
That's good.
So, I'm just going to jump ahead. No, thank you so much. So I get to work at the Community Water Center, and like I said, we use organizing, advocacy, and public education, and these are some of the individuals we work with. We work with the Agua Coalition, which has been around for a decade and has really been at the forefront of advancing for the first time in California's history regulation of groundwater pollution from agriculture. The Agua Coalition was at the forefront of that and played an integral role in advancing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act as well. So I am lucky that I get to work with directly impacted residents who are leading the charge on advancing more just water policy in California. And so just to start and focus in a little bit on nitrate pollution from agriculture, it has huge health and economic costs directly to families. So it's most acutely felt by infants and small children and pregnant mothers and with blue baby syndrome, which can cause sudden death, but it also increases your risk of multiple types of cancer. And the financial costs are profound as well. So we have many low-income communities that are actually paying twice for water. So they have to pay for the water that comes out of their tap, which they might use to water their plants or flush the toilet, but they can't drink. And then they're paying again for bottled water or some water that they can cook and drink with. And that means that some of these low-income communities and low-income families are paying up to 10% of their monthly income on water. And as many of you probably know, the source of this nitrate pollution in California's Central Valley is over 95% due to agriculture. Each year, it's 97,000 to 311,000 tons of shallow groundwater nitrate loading that are occurring in the Central Valley. And the cost is profound. It's 250,000 Californians who are impacted and that are really being served water at the tap that is above the federal legal limit, the maximum contaminant level for nitrate pollution. And the solutions cost anywhere from $17 to $34 million annually for a couple of decades, and that's really just for drinking water solutions. And then that's only for individuals on public water systems. So as you turn to private wells, it's an additional $2.5 million for point-of-use filtration. And so here are some of the calculations really getting into the numbers of the true cost of our current agricultural practices. And the one I want you to focus on is that it would be $100 to $180 per ton of fertilizer, only taxing fertilizer in the Central Valley and Salinas valleys to clean up and address this drinking water crisis. And that, I think, is really powerful, because if we assess this fee statewide, it drops even lower than that, the per ton fee for nitrogen in terms of fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer, and manure. And that's pretty close to the sales tax. And fascinatingly, fertilizer is not subject to the sales tax in California. So we have this real market opportunity to assess a fertilizer fee and clean up California's drinking water crisis and address this huge problem of nitrate contamination. And this really is disproportionately impacting low-income communities and communities of color. This is Stone Corral Elementary School in Seville, California, which is a couple hundred households. It had nitrate pollution for over a decade. I'm thrilled to say that public financing finally got them a new well, but it was not the polluters that paid for that well. And this is actually the lowest income elementary school, I believe, in all of California. And they were being forced to pay several $100s a month to supply drinking water, bottled drinking water, instead of books or teachers or classroom supplies. So it's a huge crisis in our low-income communities and our communities of color, but it is also something that affects the entire livability of the Central Valley, because if we do not change our current agricultural practices, it's estimated from the California Nitrogen Report from UC Davis, I saw someone here who worked on that, that 80% of residents in the Central Valley by 2050 will be impacted directly by nitrate pollution. And that makes a lot of sense given that 90% of residents in the Central Valley are reliant on groundwater for their drinking water. So this is really a problem that we as Californians need to get a handle on. And I am thrilled to say that this nitrogen fee or fertilizer fee is an incredible opportunity because it matches up so well the numbers with just assessing even something very similar to a sales tax to address this drinking water crisis. It would require a 2/3 vote of the legislature, which we are working on. It's a big lift, but I think it is possible actually now more than ever with the big industrial ag community starting to come to the table around possibly assessing a fertilizer fee for reasons we can get into. It gets wonky fast, but that fee would both fund safe drinking water solutions and give farmers an incentive to start reducing their nitrate contamination. But unfortunately, instead of moving full speed ahead towards this clear solution, Big Ag is actually spending its time trying to hide the data. So the Central Coast is actually a bit ahead of the Central Valley, and it's regulated regionally in California. And the initial data, this is just one map I'll show you, but those orange lines mark off how much the amount of nitrogen that the plants need, and then the blue is how much nitrogen is being applied on each field per year. So you can see when you think about the nitrate that's already in the irrigation water and then combine that with what's being applied in fertilizer, almost every single farm in the Central Coast is applying way too much fertilizer. So we really need to get a handle on this problem. It's something that I think would help farmers' bottom lines because they're over-applying and spending money that they don't need to be spending. But really, without accurate, transparent data, no one is going to get a handle on this problem. And unfortunately, ag is really fighting hard against even having field-level data on how much nitrogen they're applying annually, saying that it's a proprietary issue and they can't report that data. So this is coming to a public workshop near you in May, and I think it's a really momentous time to be advancing agricultural justice across California. So we're very hopeful that we at least start getting that basic data as well as then moving towards a fertilizer fee such that we can start to fund cleanup solutions. So just the takeaways on nitrate pollution, huge impacts, 250,000 Californians. We need this accurate and transparent reporting, and a nitrate fee is really a pretty clean policy fix that we're hopeful ag is really starting to come to the table around. And so then I just wanted to touch really quickly on groundwater supply and groundwater management, where it's unfortunate, but the low-income communities and communities of color that we've been working with for a decade at this point previously had water they can't drink, and now we're running completely out of water. And obviously, ag is not responsible for the lack of precipitation, except perhaps for the fact that greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to ongoing climate change. But the unchecked well drilling and pumping that's occurring in our agricultural regions has led to 13,000 Californians who are reliant on shallow household wells running completely out of water. And that, I don't have the pricing numbers quite as neatly worked out. There's not like a fertilizer fee we can do here exactly, so I'll have to spend more time with Hal. But just to give you a quick snapshot, Tulare County, which is really the epicenter of the drought, is spending $500,000 each month to supply water to tanks. This is Yolanda Serrato and East Porterville. It really does feel like the global south or a third world country going through some of these communities where every single home, almost every home, has a tank in its front yard. There's a water truck that comes once a week and fills up that tank with water. So I'm hopeful SGMA, as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is affectionately known, is something that's putting us on track to having some oversight over where wells are drilled, how we're managing this shared natural resource. But unfortunately, it does not have teeth until 2040. So we're working really hard to get some interim groundwater ordinances in place in the counties that are most impacted, such that there's at least oversight of well drilling applications, because as it exists in Tulare and Fresno and Kings County right now, if you're a farmer and you put in a well drilling application, it may take 6 months to get the well drillers on your property, but it is rubber stamped. Within 24 hours, you get that permit. No oversight of whether the ag well is literally 100 feet from a community's sole supply drinking water well. So huge challenges with groundwater management as well as groundwater supply. And so, yeah, definitely huge challenges, but I do want to leave you on a note of some optimism. I mentioned earlier that I have the extreme privilege of working with the Agua Coalition. They are celebrating in early May, as part of National Drinking Water Week, their 10-year anniversary. And they have been meeting every month for the past 10 years and at the forefront of some of the most impressive water justice policy fights, I would say, in California. But really just want to leave you with these 3 takeaways that the California drinking water crisis, though not solely due to agriculture, is really in many ways tied to our current agricultural practices, which can and need to change. Second, that a fertilizer fee is a real clear policy solution that when combined with transparent data so we get a better handle on the problem could help us both manage the long-term pollution of our aquifers and supply safe drinking water to residents. And finally, that collaborative, effective groundwater management, both in the short term and the long term with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is really key to ensuring that all communities have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. So I think it is really possible. We are close on many of these fights now more than I think ever in the past decade since we've been working on this, but some uphill battles, and would love to and look forward to talking more about both the challenges of supply and quality in California. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. That was terrific. It's sort of both ironic, but of course heartbreakingly ironic that it's the workers who are probably almost all working in agriculture are the ones who are suffering the real brunt of it. We heard that yesterday with pesticides. It's the same way. The farm worker incidence of a whole number of cancers is 50, 70, 60% greater than the average population. We heard from Tyler Norris yesterday. So our last speaker of the afternoon, or this session of the afternoon, is Dennis Baldocchi, who's a professor of biometeorology at UC Berkeley, and will talk to us about how he's the question of putting a dollar on this, but also not just in concept, but putting some actual metrics on that. So, and I will say just as an aside, I'm sort of particularly interested in this. Separate from my advocacy role, I manage a coffee farm in Costa Rica, which is where the IPCC studies of coffee and climate are being done. And they have all sorts of gizmos there, which are measuring the flux of carbon and nitrogen and water vapor. So I would hope I'm going to come away understanding more of what those gizmos do than after your talk. So, Dennis, thank you.
Yeah, I was trained as an agricultural meteorologist, so a lot of my interests are actually measuring and understanding water use by crops. My background actually comes from a farm here in California. I grew up on an almond and walnut ranch just across the bay here, essentially. And as a young kid, back in the 1960s, I heard stories from my dad about really the inequities of water prices in California. We drew water directly from the Delta. We had riparian water rights with our irrigation district, and we were paying the true cost of water at that time, about $10 an acre foot. And all the water from the new emerging California projects were sending water to the San Joaquin Valley, which used to be a desert, and they were paying $2 or $3 an acre foot. And what ended up happening was an expansion of the almond industry. The prices dropped. My dad had to really pull out the almond orchards, essentially. So already, as farmers, we were kind of seeing the consequences of inequitable pricing, essentially, with water. So for us to deal with these challenges, I think we really need to sit back and think about why we're in this problem and what are some of the key questions we need to ask before we can even answer them, essentially. So first of all, we need to know how much should water cost, given a limited supply and demand from numerous stakeholders, essentially. obviously, right now I did a survey of water pricing for this talk now, because I know it was still not $10 an acre foot, but I went to the internet and downloaded pricing from all the irrigation districts across the state. And right now, at least until the drought, people were paying $15 to $60 an acre foot right now. So highly, highly subsidized, essentially. Now, for perspective, my colleague Max Offheimer and David Sundin, who are ag economists, have calculated that the capital cost of water in California is $3,000 an acre foot. And during the drought, people were actually paying, where they didn't have water, about $1,500 to $1,200 an acre foot just to keep their orchards alive. So it's a mess. Obviously, I don't think farmers should be paying $3,000 an acre foot because all these wonderful crops we have are just going to move to Mexico. And all the local fruits and vegetables that grow uniquely in California, we won't have. But right now, with it being $15, $20, $30 an acre foot, the whole thing's a mess, essentially. But we also have to understand how much water is available in California, because we have two problems. One is we have normal rainfall patterns, but California developed in a Mediterranean climate with huge interannual variability. A lot of our water policy is really based on the average years and the surplus years, but I'll show you, well here, I'll jump ahead, actually, I was thinking. This is the typical rainfall pattern across the state. This is the average, but every few years we have really low average rainfall, essentially. So this is average, this is normal. Water is always scarce, essentially. And I guess I want to really add to the point, so I can go backwards, is, why are we having agriculture in California? It's a desert. Deserts have really high potential evaporation. Crop yield scales with water use. We have some of the highest yields because we have irrigated systems in a desert that have high evaporation. So in fact, in some respects, again, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but the dairy industry has moved to California. Wisconsin's not the dairy industry. This is nationwide hay production. This is California production. We have alfalfa growing in the Imperial Valley. They're getting 9 crops a year. I measure alfalfa evaporation. Alfalfa evaporates about a liter of water a year, essentially. Native ecosystems about 500 milliliters a year, essentially. Almonds also about a liter. So it gets back on this kind of this landscape of water throughout the state that we have to think about, essentially. So we need to first of all assess how much water is available for California. Given the supply, then, which crops do we want to grow, essentially? I think it's really important that we still have our valuable fruits and vegetables and nuts and stuff, because many of them don't grow anywhere else, essentially. But the biggest question is, do we need 900,000 acres of almonds right now? That most of it's going to China. And part of the reason we have $900,000 of acres of almonds is the hedge funds have jumped into it. They're printing money. They're essentially getting water at $30, $50 an acre a foot, and they're producing nuts that are worth $7,000 an acre, essentially. And we're subsidizing all that, essentially. So it really gets back to which crops should we grow with this cheap water or higher price water. And the problem is, should we be growing cheap forage crops? They grow better in Iowa than here. So should we be growing corn? We need even more corn. The dairy one's tough because, yes, the dairy industry has moved to California because of the high productivity of alfalfa, but we all drink milk and we want local dairy, essentially. So one thing I think for all this is we all ultimately are culpable because we are consumers of all this. And so we need to work with the farmers a little bit to make it better. And again, the other thing is with almonds and walnuts, they don't grow anywhere else, so sure, we should grow them here. But I think with better pricing of water, hopefully we'll get a better equilibrium of the right acreage of those crops, given their value, given their nutrition, given their desirability by the public, essentially. And I think that's really what we aim to do for, which is why we want a better cost of water. I guess I'm not advocating the full cost of water, as I said, because we'll lose agriculture. Now, the introductory points started out with the same comment. And again, Mark Twain didn't say it, would like to attribute it, but we've seen this before. I'm sure many of you have seen Chinatown. I think many of you have read Cadillac Desert. If you haven't, you should. And if you drive down I-5, I love these signs here. Congress created this Dust Bowl. My father-in-law was very Republican, and he threw this point at me and my wife. And we went back to him and said, there wouldn't be water without the government. Never said a word again on this topic. He went home and did his homework. So again, we're in this together, essentially, you know. So the thing is, why are we in this pickle? As I showed a few moments ago, we're in a Mediterranean climate. We have wet winters and dry summers. There's no rain at all in the summer, unlike Iowa. You get 40 inches of rain. We get about 20 inches of rain. So we have to rely on agriculture that's irrigated. The good thing is we have fewer diseases because we don't have the rain and some of the pests, so we can grow apricots and peaches and strawberries with really high quality. The new normal is that we're having extended droughts, and that snowpack that was our free reservoir is starting to go away because we're getting more rains at high. How many minutes is that? We're getting more rains at high elevations, and it's running off in February and March instead of in June and July, essentially. So we have to think about pricing water with the new normal, essentially. So the question is really, why are we subsidizing water? I think in the end we still will, even after a conference like this. The question is, to what degree, I think, is the bottom line, essentially. In the past, we've done it for cheaper and affordable food. We want to have more healthy food. In the past, we've had this idea of the noble individual small farmer, which is probably not the truth anymore, essentially. And it's been the basis of California's early growth. I mean, we're the great state, the 7th largest economy, as mentioned before, because it started out with agriculture, and it brought a lot of people and made this a really thriving place with Hollywood, the universities of California, the Silicon Valley, essentially. So we don't want to break that, essentially. But I think at the end of the day, we want to ask also why we shouldn't subsidize water as much as we do. And it gets back to that water is scarce. It is very energy intensive. We're using, I think, 20% of our water, our energy in one way, moving water uphill over to the Hatchabees, essentially. Lift water. It takes energy, okay? And in fact, also again, it takes money to make money, and so the cheap water is being gained. And the one thing that does worry about is that if you look at history, societies based on irrigated agriculture have tended to fail. And I don't want that to be our future. I want us to use water smarter and better. And so we have to think about better ways to do that, essentially. So what are the unintended consequences? This is really the big issue we have to think about, essentially, is that it's been inefficient use. And as we price it better, I think it'll be used more efficiently. It's been an expansion of acreage of water-intensive fruits and nuts and forage crops, essentially. You already heard about the Delta. I live in the Delta, and it's a mess, essentially. And the other point is the groundwater depletion. So I think we shouldn't be fighting among farmers and city people, environmentalists. We're in this together. We're citizens of California, and we really have to not demonize the other people, but the legitimate water users, the ag, the cities, the water quality, the river flows, the ecosystems, all desire certain fractions of that water. And we need to at least design a system that works well on the driest years. And when we have the wet years, yes, let's take surplus water and put it in groundwater and store it and then take it out later. Because we've depleted groundwater in the Central Valley. We've essentially, you've seen spots, it's dropped 10 meters, essentially. And so we just can't sustain that. So I think I will stop here. I have maybe some concluding slides just to kind of conclude. Yeah. Cheap water has provided many benefits. Cheap water has overexpanded things. Charging, I think, capitalized water will make it more equitable. Obviously, people don't want to have central planning. And again, we have to work with the farmers. I think they feel bad because they're being demonized, and they're trying to do the good thing by providing food and fiber for all of us, essentially. And I think if we work collaboratively, I think maybe we'll be more successful than trying to demonize each other, essentially. So that's my take for today, and thank you for your attention.
So why doesn't Jenny, Hal, Bill, Dennis stay up here, and we'll now take some questions. But first, a couple comments. One is, especially when I'm in California, I always feel I have to remind people about that great city on the east in New York. And I mentioned the water supply before. In New York, we had the unusual circumstance that New York gets its water, as I said, from a surface water supply. And we were required, because of the Safe Drinking Water Act, to filter that supply unless the city could show that it was protecting that water supply. A filtration plant would cost on the order of, the numbers varied, but on the order of $6, $8, $10 billion. So it became very much worthwhile for the city to spend, as it ended up doing, $1 billion or $2 to buy a lot of land around the reservoirs, to actually upgrade sewage treatment plants, to help people upgrade their septic systems, to keep that drinking water clean, because even spending $2 billion was a whole bunch cheaper than spending $10 billion. There was always a little bit of the fact that it did, as I think Bill mentioned, the situation, it was New York City ratepayers who were essentially paying these upstate folks not to dump what is essentially either human or animal waste into the drinking water. But, and there's obviously that has some very serious justice issues. But nonetheless, it was a system that to some extent worked, because we talk a lot about putting the price on natural resources. But because of the Safe Drinking Water Act and this unusual circumstance, this is one of the few places where there really was a price put on it. And so people look at that and use it as a model, but in most other cases, there's no outside force putting a price on it. So it's both a model and not a model. The other thing, perhaps just a comment, is this idea of putting a price on natural services, on the one hand, sounds radical. But on the other hand, it has actually been a part of federal law for quite a while. The 1980 Superfund statute, the 1990 Oil Pollution Act, both have provisions that are called the natural resource damages provisions. And those, in essence, say that if a polluter, a spiller, creates an oil spill or a hazardous waste spill, you're supposed to clean it up and do the best you can. But there's going to be a certain amount of damage that you can't clean up. And the spiller actually has to pay for the lost natural resources caused by his spill and either restore, replace, or acquire the equivalent of those lost services. Not a surprise, but even though this is very much of a market solution, putting a price on something, industry wasn't wild about it. But I think it's important to know that the concept of putting a price on these natural resources and these natural resource services has actually been embedded in federal law now for 40 years. It has not been a section of the law used tremendously. Every now and then, like in the BP spill or the Exxon Valdez spill, there's a high-profile case. But by and large, it's not been that commonly used.
Just on that point, a bill was introduced this year in the state senate in California to do that sort of thing, to assign a charge and a public goods charge, if you will. And there was actually a proposal in front of the state water board to do a fee across the board. All water users would pay some fee to try to do some mitigation and restoration. That proposal didn't do so well in the state water board, and we don't know how well this Senator Bolt's bill will do in the state legislature, but probably not very well. On the other hand, the bill I mentioned earlier in Congress 25 years ago, Senator Bradley and Congressman Miller did, at least for one project, this one federal water project, did adopt a restoration fee. It's basically a mitigation charge. It's really small. It's only $7 an acre, but it does generate some money for mitigation and restoration. It's not sufficient. OMB looked at it about 5 or 10 years ago and said this is really not enough to do the job. But it was try to begin this idea. But those proposals are really unpopular right now. That's the problem.
So before I open up to questions, I want to go in reverse order and ask some questions here along these lines. And for Dennis, the question would be, really following up on this, let's assume we agree that we want to subsidize water to some extent, but don't want to subsidize it too much. Mm-hmm. How do we actually set the right fee or the right subsidy level?
Well, this is interesting because I've been talking to colleagues on campus, and I think we just need to do some new analyses. I mean, we haven't thought about that so much. And right now we're actually trying to produce maps of evaporation throughout the state. I can kind of maybe show you. And so if we know how much the state is using, essentially, we can get some sense of how we can allocate it. And then I think we need to look at what's coming through from the Delta. And I think we need to start working on the years with the lowest flow and try and design a system that works best on that, and what are the right prices for water for those. And then we have more, I guess, luxury on the wetter years, essentially.
And what type of information do we need, besides what you put here, what economic information would we need to set the right price?
Well, I think it gets back to, I mean, you have alfalfa next to almonds, for example, right. And the alfalfa may to 7 tons an acre. So, and that may be only worth $500 or $600. The Ammonite orchard uses about the same amount of water, and that's producing, at least at now rates, almost $7,000 an acre. Now, if you converted the whole state to almonds, obviously the price is going to crash. And so this is where the economists need to understand that as you change the acreages, you change the mix of crops, you change the supply and demand, the market prices are going to move up and down. And so it really is a challenge for state economists to work on. It's beyond my pay grade.
So it's not, so even if we get past the conceptual hurdle of subsidy at the right level, it's quite a challenge still to get that level.
Yeah, because I really don't, again, want to have unintended consequences that we charge so much for water that we lose our markets, our crops, and then you have more economic justice problems of people not having jobs on top of it.
Right.
You know, so.
And okay, so Jenny, you were talking putting a price on nitrogen. 2 questions there. One is, has anybody done that? Do we have any models, or will California be the first in the nation to do this? And the second, similar question, are there models of how much nitrogen, how you would price it?
Yeah, there is a really innovative system in New Zealand and also one in Mexico. As I understand it, and I'm not an expert on either of those, it's not exactly a straight fee, but there is a nitrogen management system in place, both in New Zealand and then in a part of Mexico, where they were having similar problems in terms of nitrate pollution of groundwater. But I don't think either one of those is exactly a fee. And as far as how we would price it, I think it's interesting you've mentioned also a user fee too. So one of the things the communities we work with are, like was mentioned, primarily farm working communities, so it's so interesting they have a really powerful voice in this work. But they're extremely low income, they're very small, so they do not have the economies of scale to finance their own drinking water solutions. It costs millions of dollars for nitrate treatment and the ongoing operation and maintenance costs. So we need some type of subsidization to ensure that they have this basic human right to water. And there are a couple different routes. Basically, we need some type of pool of money at the state level that can be used to ensure that these communities have safe water and that they have a lifeline water rate like you see for so many other utilities, but not for water, the most basic. So one route would be going down this user fee route, but the other would be a fertilizer fee, which is a more explicit polluter pays model. And I think we're still figuring out, I think the agricultural industry in many ways might drive exactly what that pricing looks like. It could be just a straight fertilizer fee. It could incorporate manure. It could incorporate, and from our opinion, should incorporate organic forms of fertilizer as well. But the challenge, some of the numbers I threw up there were just looking at if you assess that fertilizer fee on irrigated lands agriculture in the Tulare Lake Basin, which is basically the South San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley. And so we feel really strongly that to be equitable for the farmers across the state, such that it's not just the farmers who, by virtue of geography and chance, ended up in the areas which have the highest, just the underlying geology is contributing most to nitrate pollution, that it really needs to be a statewide fee, and then it does really start to look like not a huge fee if you're assessing it across the whole state. So yeah, exciting times, and I think that something may actually move on that in the next year or two.
Okay,
Can I just follow up on that real quick? I mean,
you see, I told you he's very shy and retiring.
But the point was made this morning that if we're going to subsidize, let's get something back for it. And
right.
because the government is providing all these benefits, it's not unreasonable to say, by the way, if you want your subsidized water contract renewed or extended, we have a new condition. And the new condition is that you can't have your concrete canal go right by a community that has no drinking water. You have to provide access to that water. I mean, we have this pristine Sierra water going to crops, but it won't go to the communities that need it for drinking water. So you could do that kind of mechanism. It's not so much a fee as much as a condition on the subsidy.
So, Hal, question for you. When you were saying that during the allocation, sometimes people get too much and people right next to them have too little. Have there been any just private trading schemes, leaving aside a government-imposed trading scheme? Is there a robust private trading market? And if not, why?
And I think the reference was made that during the drought, where did that market price go up? So people, this year, the rice growers in the Sacramento Valley, who have the most historic water rights on the largest system, it was just announced that they will get 2.2 million acre feet of water off the top at the beginning. They get it for the year for which they pay a tiny amount of water. I mean, a lot of it, they pay almost nothing for that water. So they don't. The
$16 at Glen Calusa.
has told us, Glen Calusa is one of the largest ones of they're called the Sacramento River Settlement Contractors. So Los Angeles and San Diego, all the people getting their water from the Metropolitan Water District, which is the largest urban water wholesaler in the state, they go up to Sacramento Valley and say, what's it going to take for you to sell some of that water? Well, they're not even using all of that water. They've already announced that they probably won't need that full 2.2 million acre feet. I mean, remember that's enough water for 10 million people, right? And that's just to grow rice up there, and you need to leave a lot of that water in rice for a lot of reasons, including habitat for migratory birds. But you could sell some of that, and they do sell some of that, and they get a huge profit when they sell that water. And so you actually have the big San Joaquin Valley agricultural districts bidding against the big urban cities as to who gets access to that water. And there are markets, there's always been markets between farmers and between water irrigation districts. And generally, the closer the district, the buyer and seller are physically, the easier it is. If you're shipping it all the way from, remember, they said one guy in Colorado tried to sell water to San Diego. I'll just send it down the Colorado River. And you just take it out and send it over to, so if you can keep it closer by, but yeah, the market price is going way up.
This reminds me, I was stunned doing some work in Colorado. Some buildings were trying to be more energy and water efficient, so take the water that's on their roof and use it to flush their toilets. And we're told, nope, sorry, you can't do that. That water that it lands on your roof is actually owned by somebody else. And I admit, as an East Coaster, this seemed to me to be insane.
It's very important to remember, poor communities can't compete in that marketplace. Fish don't have money to buy water, and the migratory birds coming down from Canada, they don't have a lot of money to buy water either. So it tends to reward those with the deepest pockets, which tend to be either cities, big cities like Los Angeles, or the wealthiest of the agribusiness companies. So you need to have some regulatory mechanism to protect impacted third parties and fish and wildlife.
So, Bill, back to Iowa, the first in the nation. What's always an important issue when you're talking about pricing and water conservation and purity, that it be feasible. What would a farmer actually do? What would you have, if your lawsuit is successful, what will these counties actually do on the ground to prevent the nitrates from seeping down into the tiles and getting into your drinking water?
There are really two levels of response there. One of them is a regulatory one, the other one is really an agronomic one. Let me start with the agronomic one. The way to avoid nitrates leaking into surface waters in the state are to do things within the field that are different crop rotation, use of nitrogen stabilizers, things on the edge of the field. A pipe for engineers like me means a control source. I can put filtration on that. I can do a number of things to control flow, as an example, that reduce pollutants coming into the waters of the state. So we have infield kinds of things, edge of field kinds of things that can be done. At the end of the day, what we're looking for is agricultural accountability. If I have a metal plating factory, or I have a municipal storm sewer system, which I'm responsible for, when we discharge into the waters of the state or the waters of the United States, we have to have an NPDES permit. That's what we're looking for as a practical matter in our litigation. They're a point source polluter, no different than a municipality or suburban manufacturer. They should have a permit. That's what we're looking for. There are many ways, infield and edge of field, that we think that the drainage districts, not individual farmers, but the drainage districts, if you will, aggregators of that water and responsible for these private and public systems of plumbing, can in fact meet environmental responsibilities. That's what we're looking for. It is a tragedy of the commons, and the revision of the tragedy of the commons was the tragedy of the unregulated commons. Basically, what we're seeking is a regulatory responsibility that we think exists now. Both federal and state regulators, for a number of political reasons, have sidestepped that. Put a lot of regulation on urban, suburban point source polluters, but sidestepped entirely agricultural polluters who are 90% responsible for the nitrate loadings and concentrations in the surface waters of my state.
Thanks, Bill. Now we're going to open up to questions, and somebody already raised their hand. So you go first. Tell you who you are and where you're from.
I'm Nicolette Nyman. I was a water quality attorney for a while. I've been to Iowa many times, and now I've been in agriculture for the last 13 years. So this is an incredibly interesting discussion, and all the presentations were excellent, so thank you so much. My question is actually for Bill Stowe. There was a paper recently published that Aldo Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture was involved in, talking about how ruminants in the state of Iowa might be a net climate benefactor if you took crop production out and converted it to grassland. So I wanted to know what your take on that was from a water quality standpoint, or if you have an opinion, or if there's data that you guys are creating related to, sort of maybe can we get rid of some of the drainage tiles and turn some of that crop production into grasslands, and maybe with livestock on it, or just what do you think about that?
Ultimately, what I believe is the market has to be the determinant of allocation resources. I mean, that kind of sounds like a platitude, but it's nonetheless the case in my view. But there has to be a reasonable allocation of resources based on regulation. We're not going to end 150 years of drainage districts in my state. Take out those drainage tiles, try to make ruminants the livestock standard in a state that's heavily CAFO'd, and we're essentially turning California into a rainforest. It's just not going to happen. It's counterintuitive. There may be a role for ruminants, as a better model, but that has to come through the market, in my view, not some kind of fiat that you and I can reach. That wow, it'd be great if we had a lot more grass raised beef. I'm in a state that's heavily CAFO'd, has been for a number of years. Our state does two things really in terms of economic development. We incent for billions of dollars construction of cheaper nitrogen fertilizer, which is absolutely goofy. And we have absolutely no real restriction on combined animal feedlot operations. So more and more and more and more keep getting built. Local control is not allowed under Iowa law. We have a matrix system that essentially is a free drop. The availability of rangeland basically is easily trumped by the productivity of corn. A lot cheaper to raise corn, a lot more profitable to raise corn, and to deal with livestock, particularly cattle and hogs, by animal feeding operations, concentrated and combined animal feeding operations. So, in the long term that may be great, but it's going to take a lot more regulatory intervention to make that happen. The drainage districts themselves will be there. They're not going to go away. We want to regulate the effluent coming out of them. I think that can be done. Certainly the science is there. Whether the political will is there or not is a whole different issue. We believe that we have a regulatory right now under the Clean Water Act, alone under Iowa laws against nuisance and trespass, to be able to regulate them.
And like the lawyer, we can't help but answer, it depends. New York City was trying to protect its water supply, as they said, and the toughest was agriculture. And when the city started talking about addressing the dairy farms and the water supply, the upstaters had a great time running billboards of cows with diapers saying, this is the city slicker's view of farming. But of course, with relatively simple measures like keeping the cows away from the streams, we saw farms with 10-fold plus, 20-fold plus differences in pollution levels both downstream. So at least so much of the indicate seems to indicate it's not cows versus crops, but how each one is done. And there is just enormous variability.
Well, like in my book, Defending Beef, I've written 2 books about livestock production, and the last one is called Defending Beef. There's really good research in California showing that having grazing areas that the rainwater is falling on that becomes into the drinking water system is extremely beneficial for the water quality. Sure. So I'm just sort of, I know your lawsuit isn't going to change this, but I'm just sort of wondering, in the sort of bigger picture that we're talking about, wouldn't this be a positive direction from the issue that you're concerned about as well?
No question it would be a positive direction. At the end of the day, I think we all know that animal feeding operations, for a number of reasons, are inhumane. They may provide short-term economies of scale, but they create huge, we talk as Californians, you all talk as Californians about the Central Valley. That kind of economic dislocation and impact on neighbors is something as Iowans we see on a regular basis. No one wants to live in a state where an animal feeding operation is coming into play. And unfortunately, our state incenting a total of 9 million head hog new animal feeding operations in smaller towns in Iowa who hear 2,000 jobs and think that's a great deal. For those of us in the watershed, we do not think it's a great deal.
Don, who are you?
I'm Don Woodett, and I actually live in the Southwest. I'm used to water issues, but I do business in Iowa with Iowa farmers. And it's interesting on this New York model, we work with farmers that have converted 4,000 acres to organic in Iowa. So it's the elimination of what your problem is. Maybe there's a way to get them upstream from you and convert those farms to organic.
Well, of course, organic doesn't eliminate our concerns about nitrogen. We certainly hope it would have a meaningful impact on it. But the basic construct of organic raising of corn, the kind of quantities that we're talking about in our state would be a huge change.
Yes. Well, actually, our yields are very comparable. They're within 10%. And then we get 3 times the market price of what GMO corn goes for. So economically, it's a good deal for
let me talk about that for just a second, because there's a significant amount of research out there from land-grant schools like Iowa State University that says right now a different rotation, as an example, would provide a better bottom line for farmers. But the ag retailers kill that. Jane Q and John Q. Farmer are used to a socioeconomic and a culture that is monocrop related. My family who farms are not going to throw in red clover and alfalfa into their view of what farming is in the Midwest. Even though the numbers may support that, that's not our culture. Their local ag retailer reminds them, hey, by the way, we'll give you a hell of a deal on liquid nitrogen so you can put it on the fields in November so it'll run off into the waters and mitigate your risk. So we've got a lot of cultural issues that really are beyond the economics there. The model of corn on corn on corn is very real in the 3 I states, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. It is our model.
Well, I applaud you guys for having unlisted phone numbers. I understand the cultural thing. You can't go to a 70-year-old farmer and say you've been doing it all wrong for 35 years. Yeah. And then I have one other question. Steve from the Southwest. Everything I see in regards to water, and by the way, water rights and where I come from are 4,700 to 6,000 an acre. But we always pay for the transportation cost of water, which of course is coupled with energy, food, energy, and water, and now all interdependent. But we never assign a depletion cost to water. Is there any talk of really just assigning a depletion allowance to it? People can put it on their balance sheets. That helps these corporations. But in the end, when the calculation's done, they've used up their access to it, and that makes for a greater supply for the rest of us.
Maybe I'll point to Dennis for that question.
Oh, I don't know quite the answer, but I know, again, in California, they just haven't been monitoring groundwater until recently. I mean, throughout the Central Valley, if you lived in Fresno, Stockton, Sacramento, you didn't even have a meter on your house at all. So I think this drought and this scarcity is making people wake up, but again, the system is broken, and we really need to have this dialogue, educate people, and get the political will to start changing things, essentially. And hopefully the markets will shake things out.
Craig Cox from EWG.
Good, I don't have to. Just one comment on the organic. We're big supporters of organic, but Bill's fundamental problem is that infrastructure, the drainage pipes under those fields, and even conversion to organic at the scale required in Iowa. If we don't deal with that infrastructure and the people managing that infrastructure, how you can think longer rotations would help, but probably not get you down below 10 milligrams without changing that infrastructure somehow.
Craig, and you're a subject matter expert, and your entity is a subject matter expert on this issue. Ultimately, the real problem, in my view, is that you have a voluntary system of environmental protection when it comes to agriculture. And changing crop rotation, using cover crops, whatever it may be, is viewed as an expensive input, not something that culturally and economically agribusiness is committed to without regulation.
I really wanted to ask Jenny a question. So, back to nitrating groundwater. My only experience with that was when I was at Minnesota DNR, and we were and still experiencing aquifers that are essentially polluted forever because of the long residence time of nitrate in those aquifers. I don't know if that's the situation for you here, but it seems like that should have some implication on pricing, that you've actually completely forever eliminated the utility of that aquifer. That seems, at least in Iowa, the nitrate flows downstream.
Yeah, so I mainly spoke about the fertilizer fee I was talking about would only address the existing drinking water crisis due to nitrate pollution.
And is that through treatment or through?
And that could be through treatment in some cases, like with private well owners who just live basically in the middle of nowhere and have well in their backyard. It could be plain-use filtration. But I think that the message you're advancing is one that the ag industry in California also very much wants to have framed this conversation. There are ways that we could clean up these aquifers. It's granted expensive, but there are a couple of processes, and the reason I'm so excited about even just moving on this fertilizer fee for drinking water, existing drinking water crises, is in part because of a couple of processes that are trying to look at this larger question of, okay, how much would it actually cost to clean up this aquifer? And unfortunately, some of the initial pricing analyses, and I don't know if I could even jump to this, but have a little bit on this, so maybe not. But happy to look at the numbers more at some point with you, but there are, through the Central Valley Salinative Alternatives, CD salts, I'm forgetting exactly what it stands for, but a process by the Regional Water Board, agriculture and environmental justice organizations, are really starting to look at how much it would cost to clean up these aquifers. So I wasn't looking at those numbers earlier. And so this is basically if you treated it like a Superfund site, which is the most expensive way to clean up an aquifer: pump, treat, and re-inject. So you're pumping the water out, you're treating it, and then you're re-injecting into the aquifer. And that is the price tag that they've currently affixed. In some ways, that's it's really hard to estimate this number. In some ways, it's way higher. In some ways, it could be way lower than what it would actually be. But I think the main problem we see is that there are a couple of different ways to really look at this, and both of these are actually themselves pretty conservative because they're not trying to optimize the system of nitrate management to really look at the most impacted areas, look at who's polluting the most, but there are some numbers, and I think this mindset that, oh, it's polluted beyond repair is one that really just lets ag get off easy, and that is something that we as environmental justice advocates are not going to sit down at the table and have a conversation where long-term cleanup and restoration of these aquifers is not part of the conversation.
So those look like big numbers, but what's the total sales of the value of
exactly. I don't know that off the top of my head, but it is. I know even in the
big.
drought, it's been.
Do you know the number?
I
It's
think you
much
said
more than this. Yeah.
Well, they said 50 billion, I thought.
Output of Central Valley?
Yeah.
36.8 billion was in 2013.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
and
wanted
even
you-
in the drought,
Okay.
higher ag revenue year on year.
So
Yeah.
let's have a couple more. Paula, you had a question. Paula Daniels from the LA Policy Council. We all heard her a few minutes ago.
I guess I should be because I'm also on the California Water Commission. But so I have a question for all of you, just quick reaction because I'm mindful of the time. Up or down on robust water exchange as a way to provide a conservation tool in water.
Define that maybe more clearly.
So I held a workshop on this last week with Ellen Candy, and I'm going to throw around a few names, but just so you know where it comes from. Lester Stowe, Wildstone, Firestone. So there was a more robust water exchange that operated on a user level. Right now we have water transfers between districts, but on a user level, so that somebody with more, the user who lives at more senior rights, who's growing alfalfa, might be motivated in this pricing scheme to sell their water rights over to another person for a different type of use. Do you all think that this could work toward conservation? There's some that feel that it can, especially if you apply it in a sort of analogous to cap and trade way. So if you have a basin management plan that sets a sustainable yield and then you trade within that range. So that's the theory on this, and the jury's out in Australia as to whether it's going to work. But I'm just curious, from the five of you, up or down, you think it's a good idea to keep thinking about it?
We'll start with Hal. 15 seconds each.
All of those market mechanisms, the answer is it depends. You have to have protections because there are unintended consequences. There are parties that are not at the table sometimes, and so you can't just turn it open. But I think there's a place for it. I mean, I think that could work. I'm curious to hear more about the family.
Bill?
Probably more of an issue in California than it would be in Iowa, but realistically, I'm not a believer in privatizing rights through market exchanges, so I would be against.
Jenny?
I side with whatever Laurel Firestone said. I agree with my boss.
I'm open to creative ideas, but I always worry about unintended consequences, essentially. And I do like the idea of, water is a natural resource we all should have. In some respects, what's happening already is with the rice farmers, they're not using as much, and they're sending some of it already. So it's starting to happen to some degree, as I hear people speak. So.
Okay, our last question for the day.
Well, I have a comment about when we talk about culture in Iowa, that they have different culture to farm because they farm corn. I don't think that is culture, I think it's barbaric what they are doing, and we have to change some words. And also, I wonder why there is no more people of color representing the people from the Central Valley that are the main affected, And I am organizing a conference in August 5th and 6th that is called Soil Not Oil. Last year we have it in Richmond, California. This year it's going to be again in the same place. And we're going to talk a lot about water, and I'm going to prepare a plenary about oceans, because we have all these gatherings, but we don't talk about the problems in the ocean, acidification, all this stuff. So I'm going to pass around some. You're going to go to the website, or if you want to submit a proposal to present, and I can guarantee you that we will have over 60% of the tickets are going to be free for people of color and low income. Okay, so I will pass around.
Here, maybe pass one at each of the rows. Okay, I think we're done. And so first, a big round of applause for our panel.